Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the Chapter 14, Bureaucracy in general, but more specifically bureaucracy in the United States. Again, make sure you follow along with these terms as we go through. Now, when we talk about bureaucracy, sometimes it can be kind of a dirty word in terms of bureaucratic red tape and things like that, and when people are focusing on the bureaucracy, a lot of the time they're focusing on the efficiency or inefficiency within that system. But it's important to break down what a bureaucracy is in the first place. Essentially, the bureaucracy is just the collection of all executive branch organizations within the United States government. In a broader structure, bureaucratic structure is used in businesses throughout the United States, businesses throughout the world, governments throughout the world, and it's essentially the different structures and agencies and breakdown of authority. So the bureaucratic structure is an organization with a division of labor. So the person at the top is not doing the president is not checking your DMV records. There's somebody who's specialized in doing that. So division of labor, specialization in jobs, merit-based hiring, a vertical chain of command, and standard procedures. So bureaucracy has really been in the social science spectrum kind of viewed as the most efficient way to manage very large organizations, because there is a direction those organizations need to go, but the person at the very top isn't always going to be able to accomplish all the functions of that organization. So like I mentioned before, the president is not going to be checking your titles and tags on your vehicle. The mayor is not, or a governor is not going to be doing that thing. You have to have a division of labor and job specialization. So a person who is working for the EPA needs to have specialized training so they understand the policies and procedures of the EPA. We also have merit-based hiring, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But merit-based hiring ensures that the person who is people who are in these positions are not just in those positions because they have political connections, but they're in those positions because they have the qualities necessary to complete those functions well. And then probably the most important is standardized procedures. And that's one of the reasons that people kind of rail against the inefficiency of the bureaucracy, is because through the creation of standardized procedures, you can often have kind of a burden that is applied to an individual. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Now, you might not be able to read all of this, but this is kind of broken down in your book. This kind of shows that vertical structure that we were talking about in the last lecture, or in the last PowerPoint slide. It's focusing on the breakdown of the bureaucracy of the United States. And so you can see in this example, you have the president, vice president, executive office of the president in the middle here. But off of this, you have the major departments, so agriculture, defense, energy, things like that. And then below that, so each of these departments breaks down even further, and then there are independent establishments and government corporations. So we're going to talk about those in more context in a little bit. But that's a useful tool or a useful graph that you can kind of go back to and see how the government is broken down in that way. Now, when it comes to who works within the bureaucracy, or who the bureaucrats are, these are non-elected employees who are hired to carry out specific government policies. So at the state level, this might be school teachers. Every single K-12 school educator is hired by a school system. That school system is funded and operated by the county and state government. And so school teachers are essentially bureaucrats working through the process of education. You have safety inspectors. If you have government organizations that are engaging in safety inspections and things like that, those are bureaucrats. Public engineers, people who are working for the highway department, making those plans, drafting those plans, and implementing those designs. Those, in many cases, are public engineers. People who work at the courthouse, these are bureaucrats as well. So bureaucrats generally will provide the most direct interaction with government services. If you're going to pay your taxes, if you're going to get your driver's license renewed or anything like that, you're going to be interacting with a bureaucrat, And most of the time, that's the most direct form that people are interacting with their government. You're not going to be speaking to your representative on a daily basis. You might not ever speak to your representative during their tenure. But every year, you're going to be either filling out some paperwork or completing some tax form or something like that in order to get kind of in compliance with the government system. Now, when we talk about bureaucrats in general, one of the kind of misconceptions is that the federal government is this massive entity that employs millions of individuals, and that they're just kind of leeching off of the federal government dollars and that sort of thing. When in actuality, the number of federal workers, the workers at the federal level, has been shrinking over the past 60 years, while the number of state workers has been increasing. And I'll go back to the top in just a second. But as you can see, in 1965, you had 2.6 million federal employees. That grew to about 3.1 in 1990. But since 1990, there has been a steady decline to where we have just about 2.75 million federal workers, and we're projected to continue falling. On the other hand, though, what you're seeing is an increase in state and local employees. That's grown from 8 million to 19.9 or to 19.8-ish million over the past essentially 45 years. And one of the main reasons that is the case is because as the population grows, then you start to have to scale up. You need more people to accomplish the tasks. And as people kind of bring questions about in terms of the efficiency or the rate of service or speed of service in some of these services, government services, you have expansion. So when you have more students, you need more teachers. When you have more drivers, you need more people working at the DMV. When you have more court cases coming through, you need more judges and things like that. So what you have is a pretty dramatic increase, over doubling of the state and local employees over the last 60 years or so. Now, when we talk about bureaucrats generally has like a negative connotation that's attached to it, a kind of a stigma that can be attached to it, that comes largely from this era of really the 70s and 80s. But when we talk about the bureaucracy, usually we talk about civil service. And the reason I say this is because a person working in the public sector generally is working in the public sector because they have a passion to work in the public sector. There are going to be people who work in the public sector because there's a job, but there are, educators, in many cases, postal workers and things like that. They're working in these areas because they believe in the mission of that institution. And what we'll often see is kind of post or retirement benefits and benefit packages being fairly competitive in those careers. And so bureaucrats generally are considered civil servants and are selected through a merit-based civil service system. So in many ways, this is like a traditional job. The best applicant earns their position as opposed to high-level executive positions that are selected by the president. So if you want to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you submit your application, and then if you're working in a standard job within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they'll go through a hiring process, bring in interviewees, and then select the most qualified applicant in order to fill that position. Now, there are some higher roles that are kind of reserved for people who have the favor of a certain political figure, but at the really the largest part of the bureaucracy is are merit-based selected individuals who are apolitical or are supposed to be apolitical in their application and work that they do. Now, in that big org chart that we looked at before, what we saw beneath the office of the president right here is all of these little blue boxes. And all of these little blue boxes are departments. And department is basically just the largest subunit of the executive branch, and it's led by a politically appointed secretary. So when you hear Secretary of State, that is a person who is selected by the president to lead that department. It is their job to carry out or implement the will of the president and the law that is passed by Congress into their department. But most of the people below these departments or at the bureau level, those people are career officials. They are individuals who were selected on a merit system, and they are just carrying out the daily tasks of that department. So when you get under the secretary and undersecretary, you get to these bureau levels, which are further splits of the Department of Justice or things like that, and it splits down to, you've got the Forest Service, Food Safety and Inspection Service, Federal Bureau of Investigation, these basically lower units below that department level. And this is where a majority of the people who are working in federal and state governments are working. They're working at those bureau levels and below in order to carry out the daily work. Now, in the image back again, what you saw here is all of these independent establishment and government corporations. So while most of the employees are falling under this bureau or this department level system, a lot of these institutions are falling under the independent organizations. And the independent administrative agencies don't operate under a cabinet department. Now you might ask yourself, well, why don't they operate under a cabinet department? Well, generally they're either too expensive, kind of too unique, or too important to leave to private initiatives or put within a department. So you have something like NASA, which is focused largely on exploration, but you have some development in terms of security involved there. So you have a scientific mission, some security-based missions, things like that. It's a pretty important piece, and it doesn't quite fall under any specific department. What you've seen in recent years, though, with the increase in companies like SpaceX, is a little bit more privatization of space affairs. And for example, it was previously largely the responsibility of NASA to provide resources for crew resupplies to the International Space Station, and they would coordinate with the Russian Space Agency in order to send those supply units up to the International Space Station. With the advent of private spaceflight technology, specifically with SpaceX, you've seen some contracting out of these crew resupplies, and even sending crews to the International Space Station themselves on private industries' equipment. And so outside of NASA, you've got organizations like the CIA or the Environmental Protection Agency. They're falling outside of this traditional structure because they either need the freedom to operate independently, or they need the freedom to kind of be apart from these major departments in a significant way. On that big list, you also saw some independent regulatory commissions. These are basically given broad discretion to make rules and police corporations to ensure that private industries are operating in a way that is fair to the consumer, fair to the other business owners, like competitors and things like that, and ensure that everybody's kind of following the rules. They also make the rules to ensure that the will of Congress and the will of the president is upheld. So this can include things like the Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So these are groups that are policing certain industries and making sure, in terms of the FCC, that the stuff that's going on broadcast television is appropriate to be on broadcast television for the general audience. Or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, ensuring that like banks and things like that are operating in a fair and equitable way. And then the third kind of group that you saw in that big yellow box at the bottom were government corporations. And government corporations are really unique because they operate like any other private business, in which they provide a service and collect and basically are for-profit companies. However, they operate because maybe a private industry isn't going to deliver that service. Or if they are going to deliver that service, they might not deliver that to everywhere. So a good example of this is the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service operates as a government corporation because it charges money for stamps and postage. So people have to pay in order to ship supplies, ship letters and packages and all sorts of things. There are competitors, UPS, FedEx, even Amazon now. There are a lot of competitors that ship packages as well, but the U.S. Postal Service provides postal service to basically anywhere in the United States. So there's an example. I believe there is a native organization where they essentially live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and it takes several days. They're very disconnected from kind of mainstream U.S. society, and so it can take several days across very difficult terrain to get packages delivered to that area. But the U.S. has committed to delivering packages to basically anybody in the United States. So even though the U.S. Postal Service might take a hit or might take a loss in delivering those packages, they'll still deliver them, whereas UPS and FedEx would just not deliver to those locations. They're not guaranteeing delivery to everywhere in the United States. And so the U.S. Postal Service, even though it's often derided as inefficient or expensive or a money loser, things like that, it provides a service that a private organization might not provide if the government doesn't operate that corporation. Similar with Amtrak. Amtrak as really the money for freight shipping for private railroad industries kind of shifted toward cargo. Amtrak still operates passenger trains, mostly on the East Coast, but it provides those passenger train operations that might not necessarily be widely profitable for a private industry, and it allows for that connection on many of the cities in the East Coast. Outside of those main organizations, at the very top, you still have the Executive Office of the President. We mentioned this when we were talking about the presidency, and we talked about how and really one of the main things that we talked about was the people that support the president. So it's either the White House staff, it's the chief of staff, it's the press secretary, blah, 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 blah. A lot of those are political appointees, but a variety of the offices within the Executive Office of the President are staffed by bureaucrats who provide bureaucratic support. They might not be hired by the president at all. They are just a career official who is, serving as a bureaucrat in that capacity. You see this a lot with the cleaners, the maintenance people, the cooks, the experts who are working in the White House, who kind of maintain the White House regardless of what president is in office. And this Executive Office of the President has a variety of bureaucrats who are working in that kind of information gathering, the Office of Management and Budget, and places like that, where they're doing the daily work and they're not directly appointed by the president. Now, the bureaucracy we talked about as part of the Iron Triangle, and we'll kind of go back to that again in a second, but the bureaucracy can engage in the political process in a variety of different ways, and it's really got 6 stages that kind of happen in a circle. One is agenda setting, which we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about and break these all down in just a second. 2 is the formulation of policy. 3 is the approval of policy. 4 is the allocation of resources. 5 is the implementation of policy. And then finally 6 is the evaluation of policy, which leads back into agenda setting. So we're going to break those all up. So we talked about the agenda setting portion, and we talked about in the Iron Triangle the way that bureaucracies influence interest groups and influence Congress and the president itself, the presidency itself. You have the bureaucracy kind of feeding back the policy choices and execution, and then engaging with interest groups in a way to provide congressional support through lobby systems. Bureaucrats also have frontline experience and will oftentimes be called upon to help formulate policy. If a person running an EBT card distribution center, they might understand the challenges that lead to longer wait times or lead to inefficiencies, and they can work with administrators in order to help develop that policy. Once a bill is passed that creates puts a law into effect, these authorization laws provide a plan of action. And so it's the responsibility of the bureaucracy in many ways to implement that policy. And then funding is then provided through appropriations laws. So they have to kind of work it within the context of authorization laws and appropriations laws to both implement and kind of develop policy in that way. But the most important and significant policy is through that policy implementation. By implementing policy, bureaucrats are able to see what's working, what's not working. That can inform the legislative agenda going forward. They can inform that legislative agenda going forward and ensure that the systems are being operated as efficiently as they can be. Now, the work of the bureaucracy is varied, but this is largely because in the process of implementation, bureaucrats have what's called administrative discretion in implementation. They are able to implement those laws kind of in the way that best fits their community, and one of the ways they do this is through creating rules by which people can engage in these bureaucratic policies. And that might be something as simple as setting the office hours within a county, but if you set your office hours between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Monday through Thursday, people aren't going to be able to engage in that service very well. And so bureaucrats are responsible for creating the president's rules, or creating rules that reflect the president's wishes. So if they are going to change rules or make rules or anything like that, they have to give public notice, they have to hold Q&A sessions, they have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And this is an area where what we call administrative burden can be introduced. So like I mentioned before, if the president and the bureaucracy doesn't want to implement a specific law or want a specific law to be effective because maybe they are antagonistic to Congress, they can implement a system which basically mandates that this policy is only going to be, or this action is only going to be carried out between the hours of 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And this will create a burden where if people want to engage in that system, they have to take off of work or they have to make special arrangements. There's only a small window with which they can engage in that policy. And that is a burden. So those burdens can be implemented, those rules can be put in place in order to both increase or reduce uptake on these specific policies. In the same way, bureaucrats often enforce the laws. So you look at regulatory agencies like the EPA, they will take the they'll take law that's passed by Congress or by the president that says we want to reduce pollution by X amount after this amount of years. The bureaucracy can say, okay, if we're going to accomplish that, we need to make this sort of fine for this type of pollution. And so they create those laws, they create those rules, and then they can enforce those rules. And if a person is found in violation of those rules, they might have to pay a fine. Somebody might be sent to prison, things like that. So the bureaucrats enforce the laws in many ways. They also evaluate the implementation of policies. Bureaucrats report their efficiencies, are required to report their efficiencies up the chain of command, whether that's to the county level, the state level, or even the federal level. And through all that data collection and reporting, you have other bureaucrats who are taking all that data, seeing the effectiveness of those systems, and then delivering that to the president or Congress in order to decide or judge the efficiency of those plans. Many parts of the bureaucracy are tasked with promoting the public good through administration of programs, and a major aspect of that is through the bureaucratic agencies called watchdogs. These regulatory agencies impose limits and restrictions on the private sector in order to benefit the public. So making sure that everybody is following by the rules, even, like I said, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, making sure that all banks are kind of following the same set of rules so that one bank is not infringing upon the competitiveness of another bank. And if there is a private business that's kind of falling out of line with those established rules, they can be fined. They can have federal contracts withdrawn and things like that. So the watchdog mission of the bureaucracy can be a very important part. Bureaucracy also provides for the national security. Secretary of State and the Department of Defense are the Department of State and the Department of Defense are both within the federal bureaucracy. So you also have the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the federal bureaucracy. So these national security offices sometimes can clash with the legislative branch because of what they want versus what Congress wants to pay them or appropriate to them. But these executive agencies are largely focused on providing national security, ensuring that the American people are kept safe as required by the Constitution of the United States. A key monetary agency in the United States within the bureaucracy is the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before, but the Fed is a system of 12 Federal Reserve banks that facilitate the exchange of cash, checks, and credit, and they regulate member banks, and then they use monetary policy to regulate inflation and deflation. So what the Fed does is it kind of uses its own power and authority to regulate what its member banks do. Basically what the borrow rate is, because if a bank has to pay off a certain amount of debts, or the bank has to send money out, in some cases they don't have enough capital or liquid funds to send out. So they will basically borrow money from another bank. And when they borrow money from another bank, they have an interest rate that they have to pay. And so the Fed kind of facilitates that bank-to-bank interest rate, which can kind of serve as a foundational principle or foundational level for interest rates, whether it's mortgage or car loans or things like that. So the ways that banks borrow money from each other can affect the rates at which a person borrows money from a bank as well. And like I said, the Fed also has authority over the supply of money. And so if there's one of the things following the 2009 Great Recession, you had the Federal Reserve coordinating with the Treasury to basically pump more U.S. dollars into the market, which was meant to liquidate the money supply in the United States, kind of make money more transferable, put more money into circulation, which increased economic activity, and the goal for that was to increase economic activity and then kind of keep everything like a well-oiled machine up and running again. And so the Federal Reserve Bank operates largely independently. The chair of the Federal Reserve Board is basically selected by the president. But for the most part, the Board of Governors are made up of the presidents of member banks, and they kind of operate without kind of outside of legislative influence or congressional influence. This is why a lot of time you'll see both presidential and congressional antagonism toward the Fed, because they kind of are intended to operate in a way that creates financial stability in the United States. So when there's not financial stability, one of the easiest targets can be the Fed. Monetary functions also include revenue agencies. So you have agencies responsible for collecting taxes, like the IRS. And IRS is probably the one that we're most familiar with, but most of the money that comes into the United States is collected through not income taxes, but tariffs. And so you have the IRS, you have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and they're focused on basically acquiring taxes and registration fees and things like that in order to bring money into the federal government that then the federal government can appropriate to other areas, whether that's through federal grants or support of the military or whatever. And so these agencies are collecting revenue from the people, which makes them really the targets of the most ire of the people. Whereas the Federal Reserve System will be a target of ire from the Congress and the president in some cases. The IRS takes the brunt of that from the American people because they're the ones collecting income tax every year. And so that can create this system of unpopularity and antagonism. Major complaints about the federal bureaucracy are usually centered around inefficiency, and we talked about administrative burden before. But these inefficiencies are often described as red tape. So these are rules that seem overly burdensome, seem difficult to navigate, and the target here is generally about cost and use efficiency. So everybody wants to pay less to the federal government or even the state government, but at the same time, they want the services provided by those government to be as quick and easy to access as possible. Well, you can't really have both, because if you're going to be paying less, then you're going to either cut the number of positions or reduce the efficiency overall. So there is kind of this balance between cost efficiency and use efficiency within the federal government and within the bureaucracy. Now, presidents and Congress can reduce the size of the bureaucracy through several different means, but one of the most common is through the elimination of programs. There are some programs that have sundown clauses or sunset clauses where after a certain amount of years, unless they're renewed by Congress, they will just disappear. They will no longer operate. And so what will happen many times is once it's reached its set period of years, that program will just end and it will not be renewed. And that's one way that the Congress or the president can kind of reduce the bureaucracy. In the same way, the president can eliminate certain executive branch programs or even draw down some of those executive branch programs in order to try to make that system a little bit more cost effective. And then another process is called devolution. And a devolution process is when one government kind of devolves a service to a lower level of government. So you can take a program that is operating on the state or the national level and then devolve it down to the state level. And now the states individually take on that cost. And if the state doesn't want to take on that cost, then state to state, they might eliminate some of those programs if they're allowed to by law. But that kind of shifts the burden of administration to the state rather than to the federal government. Privatization can also shrink the bureaucracy. If there is a road project that is going on, many states have their own Department of Transportation where they will complete their own road project. But what you can do as a state is then, or just call it out for bids, use the money that you would have allocated to the Department of Transportation and pay a private contractor in order to carry out that specific task. So many government jobs in general are done by contractors. A lot of security jobs are done by contractors. A lot of medical jobs are done by contractors and things like that. Now, it can provide some cost reduction, but in many cases, you kind of give up oversight. So the goal is that, okay, yes, you want to have cost reduction, but if cost reduction comes at worker abuse, then you could have a potential issue. So you don't necessarily have the same oversight that you would if it is a job that is conducted by the federal government or a state government. And so when it comes to the management of the bureaucracy, at the end of the day, the president is the chief executive of the bureaucracy. Basically, the president's at the head, in charge of all of these systems. And management is usually conducted by putting personnel into place. So we talked about the presidential appointment of all of the different department secretaries. I think in total there's between 1,000 and 3,000 positions that a president selects and appoints through a patronage system once they have been elected the president, which is largely one of the roles of a presidential transition team. A president can be elected in November, and they set up a transition team to start trying to fill those roles. And one of the areas of criticism is if you're not quick enough in getting those roles filled and those jobs aren't being done, that can create tremendous inefficiency within a federal government system. Now, even though the president is the chief executive, Congress holds the purse strings. Congress is the chief financial officer. They're the ones who provide funds. So if Congress wants to exercise control over agencies, they can just reduce their appropriations. And through reducing their appropriations, they can say, we want you to reduce your appropriations in this way. And maybe the bureaucracy will, or maybe they'll try to find other cost-cutting measures to try to kind of squeeze and find ways that they can reduce those costs overall. And so in making those decisions, Congress kind of conducts oversight of the bureaucratic agencies. And they'll do that through hearings and things like that. And they can either be through police patrol, where every once in a while they're going to call up bureaucratic agencies to have them report, or they can conduct that through fire alarm patrol, where they have there's a scandal or an issue within a specific area, or a certain agency is costing way too much money, then they can call those agencies in and kind of outside the regular order, and then bring them in and ask questions and things like that. So ask yourself these questions as we go on. Do you think citizens expect too much when it comes to cost efficiency and use efficiency? What would you be willing to sacrifice? Would you be willing to sacrifice accuracy and speed, or accuracy if it meant more speed, or accuracy or speed if it meant more money in your taxes and things like that? And then ask yourself, have you interacted with any member of the bureaucracy today? And what service do you think you might take for granted? So as we go forward, make sure you're paying attention to those kind of questions and things like that. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Bye.